Flight attendants and pilots of Reddit, what are some things that happen mid-flight that only the crew are aware of? Pilot is sleeping and co-pilot is flying and there are dead bodies in the cargo. Source: my mom, who is a former flight attendant. An instructor told me that he and his training buddy both fell asleep for about 45 minutes at the same time. While gaining hours for licensing, the plane was in complete autopilot mode. Clear skies. Zero turbulence. They both swore if they ever flew again they would hand off sleep like handing off the controls. Edit. For further context, he told me that after both of them awoke, they were ducking terrified. Neither had no idea what had happened, even if anything had happened. Luckily, it was over the Gulf of Mexico and at a low enough altitude where it wouldn't impact commercial airliners. Their trim was set before the nap, so they only gained a couple hundred feet of altitude. But rest assured, each were not happy with themselves. They immediately contacted ATC, verified their position, and turned around to go back to the airport, white palming the yoke the entire way. Oh, and this was at night too. They needed the night experience. Edit 2. They were in a Cessna 152. This wasn't an oxygen issue. It was just two buddies not communicating with each other and both assuming the other was flying. Edit 3. You're right. C-152s don't have autopilot. By autopilot I meant trim, which would confuse people. They were also very lucky the trim was set to gain altitude, not lower. I was just speaking in layman terms for the non-pilots to understand better. Like I said, they were definitely thoroughly freaked out and both admitted how badly they ducked up. Pilots are on their phones or reading the newspaper all the time. Pilot here, late to the party as usual, but sometimes the passengers may be having a nice quiet flight in the back while the pilots are up front dodging thunderstorms and yelling their heads off. We will not only transport dead bodies, but also live transplants, like hearts and lungs. I particularly like the live transplants because we get to cut to the front of the line for takeoff and we get all the shortcuts to our destination. Tip for those who get motion sickness: try not to move your head around. Pilots move their eyes instead of their heads to look at the instruments in the flight deck. Also try to sit in a seat over the wing. This area of the plane doesn't rotate as much during climbs and descents. Flight attendants can't do pilots' job, and pilots can't do flight attendants' jobs for sure. We aren't hired for our people skills. Don't take off your shoes to go to the bathroom. People pee on the floor all the time. Edit. Wow, you'll rock. Thanks for the gold, guys. Blue skies and tailwinds. There's a special frequency called guard that all aircraft are supposed to monitor. It's for emergencies, or for when an aircraft ends up on a wrong frequency and the controllers need to get contact with them to change them to the right frequency. It's full of pilots meowing at each other, and people accidentally asking for gate assignments and making other radio calls. Pilot here. We only get paid when the doors are closed and the pushback is commenced. If we're delayed or sitting with the door open, we're just as annoyed as you are. At altitude we're constantly in contact with air traffic control and change to different center frequencies, or control for other than US locations. We're also doing fuel checks to make sure the fuel burn isn't abnormal, dodging weather, and probably itching about scheduling. Edit 3. Thanks for all the great responses and questions. I gotta sleep, but I'll answer all the questions as I'm able, and feel free to ask more questions and I'll get back to you. Full stop. Prisoners are transported on commercial airline flights sometimes. Law enforcement officers are escorting them. On days with low ceilings, visibility and overall crappy weather, we may end up being within minutes of making the decision to divert you to fuel, especially if we end up having to hold. This isn't to say we don't have enough fuel. Legally, we must have enough fuel on board to shoot an approach to our destination, go around, fly to and land at our alternate airport if we have one, and even then, still have 45 minutes of fuel on board. Armed law enforcement officers on board sometimes, not escorting anyone. Flying faster to get there earlier if a crew member has a commute to catch home. Chatting, joking with ATC if frequency isn't busy. Delta pilots reporting light shop. Pilot making PA announcement over frequency rather than PA. Yes, meowing on guard. as well as other nonsense. Asking ATC how the rides are only to be told they suck at all altitudes. We try to get away from the turbulence, but it's not always possible. And we can't predict it. And can't see it. Can only make educated guesses as to where it may be. It's hot back there. During the summer mostly. We know. We have it blowing as hard as it can and cold as it can. We're sorry it ends up feeling like a baby's breath. Meanwhile our air vents are keeping us cool, if we're lucky. The iPad you may see us in the cockpit has all our manuals, approach plates, maps, checklists etc. Basically almost everything we need. It really is incredible. Just hope that they both don't decide to brick themselves at the same time in the air. Yes, there isn't a single cloud in the sky where we are now. Meanwhile our destination is encompassed by a massive thunderstorm. We don't like being late either. But we're paid to deliver living passengers. And we can't collect that paycheck if we're also dead. There's a chance your flight could be a pilot's very first flight in an actual jet. He could be fresh out of training, out of the simulator, and actually flying that jet aircraft. Scary, right? Well, that pilot could probably explain every single system of that aircraft in depth. Guys that have been flying the line for years, maybe not quite as in depth. Oh, and that brand new jet pilot is flying with a Czech airman. Who is there to further teach that new pilot about flying on the line? The autopilot can fly for a majority of the flight. We have to at least take off and land. Auto land isn't used for everyday normal operation. Different airlines have different rules on autopilot use. We must have the autopilot on above FL 200, 20,000 FT, unless it is in up. So we can hand fly up to that altitude, and sometimes do. If we never go above that altitude, we can hand fly the entire flight, never turning the autopilot on, which we also sometimes do, and is often encouraged to maintain piloting skills. Edit. I'll add more as I think of them. You could be asleep in the back while the pilots are battling caution messages about some system that decided to throw a hissy fit. Planes often have broken equipment on board. It's just the nature of the business and things break. Can't always fix it. So there is an approved list of things that may be broken. And how long they may be broken before they must be fixed. Could be something that doesn't affect us much. Like a brake temperature sensor isn't working. Or be something that requires some of the crew to account for it. Like a thrust reverser being inoperative. Or navigation GPS in-up. Not stuff that makes the flight unsafe. Just maybe more work for the pilots. Also, the captain can always reject an aircraft if he feels it is unsafe. If you ask us not to turn on the chemtrails this flight, we are legally obligated to comply. Edit. Due to overwhelming concern, I must put this here. More than, yes, it's a joke. No one has asked, but if you do, I bet the pilots would get a kick out of it. Also, they are called contrails. We're not customer service. We don't know where your flight is leaving out of, or how to help your problem. We'll try to help, but we'll usually try to direct you to a gate agent or actual customer service who can help you. Not trying to be rude. We just really can't help you. Another person may be sitting up front with the pilots in what's called the jump seat. It could be a pilot commuting to or from work, a Czech airman observing, or an FAA jump seater observing to make sure we are following regulations. Pilots and their families get flight benefits. Same for flight attendants. We can fly for free, or discounted. We list on a standby list, and only after all paying passengers are on board. Standby passengers may be boarded. It's hours of boredom interrupted by moments of sheer terror. When a fatal aircraft accident happens, all pilots mourn. Pilots are a close-knit group. We may hate each other's guts at times, but never wish the worst. The view from the cockpit is amazing. Sunsets, sunrises, lightning storms at night. Flying over mountains and landscapes never gets old. The captain, pilot, and first officer, co-pilot, are both fully capable of flying the aircraft. Each pilot is designated a role, either pilot flying, PF, or pilot monitoring, PM. PF is the one actually flying. PM is monitoring what the PF is doing. To back him her up, usually crews switch roles every flight or every 2 flights. So captain is PF for first 2 flights, and FO is PF for next 2 flights. Yes, the FO actually does fly the plane. This started off with us blissfully unaware, ended with mild panting. I was flying to France in one of those planes with the TV screen up front to show the flight path and where you currently are. I was just about to fall asleep when the captain asked over the PA if there was a doctor on board and if they could go to seat. I knew this was bad. The flight path changed to Canada and we had to make an emergency landing. We were stuck there for 2 hours. When we finally got to France, his entire row was quarantined off. I have no idea what the duck happened. I've got an original one for you all. There is a radio frequency we all are required to monitor. It's called GUARD. It's for emergency use and is designed for maydays and for air traffic control to reach aircraft that may have lost radio contact or to relay messages from aircraft to other aircraft, etc. Every day this frequency is abused. You will hear hundreds of professional aviators meowing, yelling obscenities at each other, and making fun of one airline or another. Oftentimes what will start it is some poor guy accidentally transmitting his PA announcement to passengers on the GUARD frequency, followed by the very mature outbreaks for about 5-10 minutes. It's the worst on the East Coast. Edit. Just today I heard an airline aircraft trying to relay info about a medical emergency on this frequency through one of their fellow company aircraft. They couldn't finish any of their sentences without people yelling "Yeah on GUARD, hey nobody cares about yeah passenger, hey you're on GUARD 2A." A former teacher told us a story that fits the question. Every year he would make trips to Europe that were for an educational experience or related to the subject he taught in one way or another. In reality, it was just an amazing way to spend 2 weeks in Europe. One year he took a student's brother with, since he needed an extra person to have the minimum amount of required students. After the 10-hour flight, the flight attendant walks up to him and asks if said brother was a part of his group. He says yes. Apparently, on the flight he stopped the flight attendant and asked her to have sex with him in the bathroom. She denied, but he continued to ask her several more times through the flight. It reached a point to where she no longer felt anywhere near comfortable. She asked my teacher if she could notify the authorities and have him sent back to the States. He agreed. There were no immediate flights back home, so a distant relative of his had to be contacted. He stayed with a relative he had never even met for an entire weekend. He was then put on a flight back home the following week. TL. DR kid repeatedly asks flight attendant to have sex with him during his 10 hours flight. She contacts authorities. He gets sent back. Edit 1. Spelling. Flight attendants don't get paid on the ground. Only flying hours are paid. We are slave labor on the ground and duties are continually added to our unpaid work time because the company knows they don't have to pay us. We show up 2 to 3 hours before we even start getting paid, and some days we will work up to 14 hours and only get paid for 5 or 6 of those hours. It should be illegal. Please be kind when you are boarding the plane and getting all pissy about your bags etc. The flight attendant is a volunteer while she is helping you on the ground. She is essentially doing you a favor. The scariest moment of my day is when the FA opens the internal bag door, the closet we all throw our overnight bags in, without calling us in the flight deck first. That ding and master caution gets me every time. My uncle was a pilot. He says that most people don't understand how much of the airplane is run by computers. The pilots are necessary, but a lot of the elements of flying are automated nowadays. Most airplanes don't even have a phalange. Pilot here. Most of the time the passengers are not given the full answer on why a flight is delayed or cancelled. Airlines will typically blame cancellations on unrelated events, weather, instead of mechanical issues, so they don't have to pay for hotel rooms, meals etc. Also, chemtrails are not real. For those of you who believe they are real, give your head a shake. As an air traffic controller, we are constantly swearing and yelling at pilots when we're not on the frequency, and then when we key up we use our nice guy voices. One of my all-time favorites is the captain accidentally broadcasting his passenger briefing, welcome aboard, weather in Chicago and so on frequency instead of the aircraft PA system, blocking up ground, ramp, tower, etc. For a solid 15 seconds. You automatically become the laughing stock of the airport. 1. One split second of instinct combined with piloting skill decides if you land on the runway or on the side of it. Most of the runways are 45 meters wide, and on a gusty summer afternoon or during thunderstorms I take God's name more than Pope himself. 2. A smooth landing is not necessarily a good landing. One can make a smooth landing and it will feel good for passengers, but it could be a risky landing if the pilot decides to use extra runway. Never shout at your pilot for a bad landing unless he crash lands. And if he crash lands and you can shout at him, understand that you are alive because of him. Edit. For clarity. And thanks for my first gold, anonymous redditor. As you know Justice said, more than better thump it onto the touchdown zone than grease it on 2/3 of the way down the runway. Bonus fact, many a times aircrafts coming in to land go back up in the air. This is a scary experience for many engines. After being relatively quiet for a while, roar back to life and aircraft is pulled back up. This is called a go around. This happens because either the runway is not clear, weather is something that can't be negotiated properly for landing, or the pilot is not at the right place and right configuration. Go around is something that is emphasized by all the senior trainers and authorities, as it is better to go back up in the air than to be in a precarious position while forcing into land. So whenever your pilot does a go around, be happy that he is a safe pilot. I worked with a pilot that was really old. He couldn't stay awake in flight. The first officer kept having to poke him and wake him up. We kept feeding him black coffee, but it didn't help much. I asked him if he was retiring soon, but he said he couldn't afford it because our airline has no pension program and the pay scale is pathetic. Pretty scary. Not a flight attendant or a pilot, but I discovered there is such a thing as a head when I saw one of the flight attendants giving a blowjob to one of the pilots mid-flight. Now, the thing to keep in mind was this was before 9/11, when the cockpit wasn't kept so securely locked. There was a bit of a bug spreading around the plane, which I was asked to take care of since I was the only doctor on board. I made my way to the cockpit to inform the pilot of the condition of the passengers, and as soon as I opened the door, I see the flight attendant bent over with her head in the pilot's lap. I could not believe what I was seeing, but I managed to snag a quick photo of it. Pilot and co-pilot are exchanging files and playing video games together via Wi-Fi. We sat in a backed up queue for hours in Denver one time. The weather had the airport socked in. Nobody was going anywhere until this giant supercell cleared the end of the runway. During that time, suddenly there appeared a mechanic at the front of the cabin on the PA holding up a 2-foot-long piece of metal he had pulled from one of the tires. He explained if the plane hadn't been sitting waiting, he might have never spotted it. It could have come flying out during takeoff roll and penetrated the plane's wing, igniting fuel, or whatever. Everyone cheered him. What a hero. He possibly saved our lives. To this day I have no idea why they let him come on board and tell us this. Ex-airline employee here. Often we'd have someone on board with terrible body odor. You can set the temperature in one end of the cabin hotter and it localized the smell to one part of the plane. If you see coffee filter bags hanging anywhere, it's because someone smells like openness somewhere on the plane. FARs often talk about the hot guy in 23B or whatever seat he's in. Pilots duck around a lot up front. They'll take pictures, post on FB, watch movies. Automation has taken over a lot of the work on long flights. Edit. Not really on topic, but don't ever walk barefoot or in socks on an airplane. The same mop that mops the lav, mops the galley. Not sure if it's been mentioned already. I was learning to be cabin crew at college, and in the event that someone dies on board, the CC, cabin crew, make it less obvious that they have passed. Put glasses on them, maybe a hat. Essentially dress them up as subtle as possible to not alert and or panic the other passengers. Far here. Crop dusting. Basically farting whilst we walk down the aisle due to the bloating. If you fly frequently, there's a high chance an FAR has farted right by your head as they walk down the aisle. My cousin is a flight attendant. It's not mid-flight, but airplane lines will fly attendants all over the country just in case they're needed elsewhere. My cousin had to fly out from Portland to Seattle and some other places all in one trip, never having to work. Also, if you are sick, you have to show up anyway and let the people in charge decide if you can fly or not. If you don't, you get 3 warnings, then you're fired. Newly hired Delta Airlines pilot. Majority of the time I am not flying the plane. I am on Reddit. As an airline agent, I can't even tell you how often the crew is hungover. More often than not. Also, the flight attendants use their personal phones Wi-Fi in flight, but that's probably not very surprising. I'm flying a plane now. Look up and I'll wave AR. I was only a month or two out of IOE, initial operating experience, at my first airline job. Flying right seat in a regional jet. I had just come back from the bathroom when the captain pointed that several flight instruments on his side had failed, and he had reverted to using data from my side. Basically told his main flight display to start using data from the second independent system soon. However, that went bad too. The autopilot disconnected. Here we were at 25,000 feet or so, in icing. Hand flying off a tiny little combined last ditch backup instrument called an IESI, Integrated Electronic Standby Instrument. If memory serves, we declared an emergency, asked ATC to point us in the direction of better weather, and tried to figure out what the hell was happening. Icing on both primary pitot tubes maybe, though that shouldn't happen, they are heated. In any case, we ended up making a perfectly safe landing after a diversion. And the passengers never had any idea that, for a few minutes, I was really concerned that things were about to turn very, very bad and that we were down to our emergency backup gauge. That's the shortened version without most of the techno babble anyway. Saw inside a cockpit when we flew back home from Orlando to Norway and the pilot was asleep. I kinda freaked out for a second, but the attendee said it's normal. It freaked me out too much. Then the second co-pilot waved at me and said hello in some other language. There's a 600-page book in the cockpit with every single thing that can possibly go wrong. From a bulb going out to an engine falling off, a biohazard or a bomb threat. I'm not a pilot or flight attendant, but I have a good working relationship with my teacher and his friends who is a mechanic and pilot respectively. One such thing that happened was he had to fix the navigation mid-flight. Not an airline pilot yet, just got hired by my first airline and start class next month, but I've been a pilot for 6 years. I primarily teach Chinese airline pilots how to fly, but I've done some passenger operations in business aircraft on the side. First of all the comments about pilots making cat sounds and Chewbacca noises is 100% true. Also, whenever someone leaves an area and switches frequencies, they yell "see ya" and then a dozen other pilots will key up yelling "see ya" one after another. We also enjoy talking it about people who say "with you." Got M on the fish finder. Any traffic please advise. And tree and fife. Also, the things that scare passengers don't faze the pilots one bit. We don't give a shit about turbulence or having to do a go around. The things I don't like are things you generally won't know about. Thunderstorm dodging, microburst alerts, ice, maintenance issues, etc. This channel is for emergencies only. Meow. Former flight attendant here. Landing gear got stuck on descent. We flew in circles for ages just waiting to find out if we needed to crash land or not. Luckily the gear eventually came down. Passengers never knew something was wrong. One time I accidentally spilled coffee creamer on a bald dude's head while he was sleeping during service. Myself and everyone around him silently agreed to say nothing. He looked as if a bird pooped on his head, but I still feel guilty about it. Never drink the coffee. I have never seen those machines cleaned. Not a pilot and didn't happen in flight, but I saw the pilot watching porn in the cockpit, on a laptop, when boarding the plane. Felt very inappropriate. An uncle who was a BA first officer, Captain's itch, as he put it, on Concorde, 1987, North Atlantic just south of Greenland, 1,140 hours, 55,000 feet, the military radars. A flight of Soviet fighters were practicing intercepts against it. The captain himself didn't know until they were informed on the ground. I'd have gone to flight level 62 and got asked to at least 1,200 if I'd have known. Nobody short of an SR-71 could intercept that. Don't fly with an ear infection or fluid in your ears. There is a chance you can rupture your eardrum. Flight crews are especially susceptible to this since we are constantly going through pressurization and depressurization when we work. Yeah, not gonna read this. I don't want to know. Next time I get on a flight. You should never eat the fish. Not a pilot or FAR, but once when I was flying to Chicago we had some mechanical problems. It sounded like an engine went out. The pilot got on the mic and said that the reverse thrusters went out in one of the engines and we needed to make an unscheduled stop somewhere in BFE. The plane landed, but took a really long time to stop. We all were put on another plane going to Chicago and were told to just grab an open seat. I later asked a pilot friend of mine about that. I wondered why a problem with the reverse thruster in an engine would be caused to make an emergency landing. He told me that it wasn't. The reverse thrusters get pressurized when the landing gear goes down so they can't be used mid-flight. There is nothing serious about them going out that would require an emergency stop. He then told me that the pilot lied to us as it was probably something much more serious like the engine going out. Just like I thought. I might be a little wrong on the details, since this was almost 10 years ago. Pilot here. Guard frequency is basically pilot Reddit. It's just people meowing and making fart noises. It's literally set up to monitor for aircraft in distress, emergencies or radios being in the wrong frequency, but it's so safe here in the US to fly that it's basically one big meme. Flight attendant here. We never actually leave the tarmac. People think we're flying but we really just have big screens that cover all the windows to make it look like we're in the air. But in reality we just shuffle the planes in and out of one hangar that is behind the airport that you can't see from the road. This is actually classified information but I'm sure this will get buried. So what the hell? It's a little known fact that on every intercontinental flight there's an about 0.1% chance of encountering airborne goblins. Now, these creatures are certainly frightening to look at, but not necessarily malicious or dangerous. The real risk only arises when they find themselves sucked into the turbines and interpret this as a threat. If they do, they often will attempt to retaliate by chewing off the wings or taking control of the plane and crashing it into the ocean. They are a primitive race, but their access to advanced spells and sharp teeth make them a force to be reckoned with even for seasoned aircraft personnel. Not a crew member, but I can give you something interesting. Big planes have some fancy systems dedicated to giving pilots info on the movement of planes that are very nearby and providing instructions to avoid collisions. Called TCAS. If another plane ever gets close enough to the one you're on to make TCAS yell at the pilots to perform an evasive maneuver, you'll probably never know. TCAS issues a few levels of warnings that start when planes are still quite far apart, allowing pilots to respond to these rare situations with much gentler maneuvers than a layman might expect. No need for high G stuff that would make the plane harder to control and disturb the passengers. Just an innocuous climb or descent that we'd gloss right over in the back. There is quite often someone with a firearm on board, and a lot of the time it's one of the pilots, FFDOs. Definitely, absolutely, without question a pilot. Spirit Airlines doesn't actually have planes. They put you on a bus and catapult it across the planet. An arguably more ambitious feat than flying a plane.